who I am and where I come from. I'm a Canadian. I was born 800 miles due north of Billings, Montana, out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't actually in an igloo, but the closest diving for me was a 16-hour drive away, and it looked something like this. Coral reefs to me, as a kid, were something that was just unimaginable. It was so far away, it was so foreign. And what really got me excited about coral reefs and what got me into it was this. Anybody recognize that? Waikiki Aquarium coral reef display. One of the first coral reef tanks that was ever set up and successfully kept, where people were actually growing these animals in a public display aquarium. And that really got me excited about coral reefs. And I was growing up as a kid, as a little larval biologist, a baby biologist. I really got into tanks, and I got into saltwater aquaria, and I just spent hours staring at the tanks and trying to understand all of the organisms in them. How did they work? What made an aquarium successful? Why did some people's fish tanks with corals in them do so incredibly well, and other ones turn to sludge? And for me, that sort of guided my entire career as I grew up from a little baby larval, sort of coral biologist, and went through the evolution towards a professor. I moved around a lot. I went through my undergraduate at the University of Alberta. I moved on to a master's degree at the University of North Carolina. Then I moved on to a PhD over in California before I was recruited to come here to the University of Hawaii about 20 years ago. And a lot of people have accused me of being attention deficit disorder because my research touches on a lot of different things from a lot of different areas. But all of them have something to do with coral reef conservation and management, and how do we actually manage our resources to have better for our kids and the future. How many of you guys have seen Chasing Corals? So this movie, basically, when it came out, really changed the way that a lot of people thought about coral reefs, because they put out this imagery of showing a coral reef dying before your very eyes out on the screen. And it was upsetting to people, because coral reefs are incredibly beautiful and enormously valuable. If we calculate how much money it would take for us to replace the services that the reefs give, it's in the trillions of dollars. So it would cost us money. There's more than 1 billion people on this planet that rely on coral reefs for some part of their food. 500 million, that's their only source of protein. So when we talk about the value of coral reefs to human beings, they're incredibly valuable, and they make a huge difference in our lives, whether everybody realizes it or not. But they're in trouble wherever we look. And there are plots like this coming out all over the place, where if we look at the Caribbean, coral cover has dropped. If we look at the Great Barrier Reef, coral cover has dropped. And people have done a really good job of putting out into the newspapers problems with climate change, ocean acidification, and a lot of the problems that coral reefs are facing. But they also face a huge number of local impacts. Sedimentation, you heard about fishing and removal of herbivores with your last talk, if people were there. Pollution and those sorts of things that are also impacting coral reefs. And it matters to people because it is really depressing when you go out and you have been diving or growing up in an area where you go out snorkeling and you see this all the time, and next thing you do, there's an event and it looks like this. And so there are a whole bunch of newspaper articles coming out that say more than 90% of the world's coral reefs will die by 2050. And for me, that's really depressing, because I'm hoping I will see 2050, and I'm hoping that there will still be coral reefs there. And so a lot of my lab and our research focuses on trying to make sure that happens, and to understand what is going on and why coral reefs in some places are doing so poorly. Now, this is a plot of different climate change models and how the temperature is going up with all of these different predictions based. And so this bottom one is if we all stop burning any fossil fuels immediately and never do it again, then the temperature won't go up very much. But the rest of them, ranging from business as usual on down, say that temperatures will continue to increase. And if we take a look at the actual data, it's worse than the models. We have seen actual temperatures changing on the order of about 1.7 degrees Celsius over the last 48 years. So it is actually something that we can measure over the last 50 years that this is happening. And you see a lot of news about climate change and the impacts. And basically what a bunch of scientists have done is put together the data to look at when do coral reefs suffer mass bleaching. So you heard in the news, I'm sure, about the 2015 event where we had mass bleaching around Oahu. If you got into the waters off Kona or off Maui, you would see 50 to 80% of our corals stark white, and about half of them died. It was a really impressive and depressing event to watch unfold in Hawaii, and it's the first time that it ever happened here. But when people look at these climate change models and say, how warm does it have to be for that to happen every single year? That's where that number 2050 comes from. Basically, when the oceans go up by about 1.5 degrees, coral reefs will have an annual bleaching event, and people will have predicted that most of the reefs on the planet cannot survive that. And so you see all of this out in the news. People have started to capitalize on this chasing corals way of presenting, where you can take a look at a beautiful coral reef before the event and what happened after, or it's through time, or so on. Decline of coral reefs. But I find that most people that I talk to, when I talk to them about this, it's incredibly depressing, and most people's typical response to that is to give up. What can I do about climate change? How can I make a difference? If this is going to happen anyway, coral reefs are doomed, and we should give up. And that is an absolutely terrible message that I blame the press for not doing a good job on getting out to people what is actually going on.
I have a question to ask you.
Yes?
This prediction to 2050, does that assume that the coral types existing now will be the same types that existing in decades?
It does. And we'll talk about that in a little while. That's a great question, so I will come back to that. And I also wanted to talk about, there are some places that are not showing this pattern. And we actually have one of those right here in Hawaii. And the reefs of Kaneohe Bay are one of these puzzling cases where they're actually doing surprisingly well. And this is really interesting because Kaneohe Bay is this very unusual thing in Hawaii. All of the islands have been formed by volcanic eruptions. The volcano where the Big Island hotspot is, they form the islands, and as the plates move, the islands cool off, subsist, and move their way up Oahu, Hawaii, all the way up to Midway and Kure, if you keep following the chain. What happened here on Oahu is this chunk, the pali, the cliffs of Ko'olapoko, the reason that this area is really unusual is that the volcano basically fractured. And what happened is half of it slid off into the ocean. So the reason that we have this incredibly flat, amazing place to live, butting up against these amazing cliffs that are straight up and down, is basically because the mountains slipped off and flattened out the area. So if you look at it from the air, all of this was basically the side of the mountain that slumped off about 1 million years ago, and then erosion has cut all of those sort of ruffles into the mountain range and piled that up down below. And so we have runoff that builds up things like the sandbar and those things. But what we have also here is a barrier reef that drops off into deep water. So the mountains are really steep, and the waters around us are very deep, thousands of meters deep. And so what happens to form this bay, we have a coral reef out here that almost nowhere else in the main Hawaiian Islands, this is the only actual barrier reef in the Hawaiian archipelago, And so we have this big protected lagoon with a barrier reef out there that limits water flow. So as waves come in, they break over the top here, they deposit more sand up on the sandbar, which is why we get that there, and then water flushes out on the north side of the bay, or makes its way around the south side of the bay and flushes out the sampan channel on this side. Because we have this bay that is so shallow and so full of life, and it takes water on average about 30 days for it, if a wave breaks over here and the water comes this direction, cycles around and goes back out, it takes that piece of water, if you were to follow it, 30 days to make its way around the bay and get back out. That limited exchange allows the sun to warm it up. Whenever you go swimming, you take out the keiki and you go to the really shallow parts on a day, that part's warmer. It's not because they're peeing. They're out there, that part is warming up from the sun. It doesn't have as much exchange and that area warms up. The same thing happens with the ocean. Kaneohe Bay is actually a warmer place naturally. It averages about 1.5 degrees warmer than the open ocean right outside of it. And because all of the animals that live in it are breathing, they're producing CO2. When we breathe in, we take out oxygen, we produce CO2. This is the same thing that is causing global climate change. So if we look at the water of Kaneohe Bay, it averages about 500 microatmospheres, goes up as high as 1,000, twice what climate change predictions would say, in Kaneohe Bay, every day, always. It is a really amazing place because it is naturally warmer and more acidic than anywhere else in Hawaii. And if those simple predictions that warmer and more acidic will mean that every coral reef on Earth will die, there should not be any coral in Kaneohe Bay. But there is. Now, I am incredibly privileged to work on Moku Oloi, and this is our lab out here. I get to go there every day, I get to go see it, and when I moved here 20 years ago, I thought this is the most amazingly beautiful place that I could ever hope to end up. And I still, every day, when I'm sitting there on the boat, taking my commute, staring back at the ko'olaus, I think, how did I get so lucky? It is just a gorgeous place. And looking over the side of the boat, you see coral everywhere. And if you talk to a bunch of the kupuna from the area and folks who have lived there their whole lives, Kaneohe Bay has always been known as the Coral Gardens. It had some of the highest coral cover and some of the most diversity around the island, all the way up until 1940. And then something changed. I call it the crappy years because the city of Kaneohe built a sewage treatment plant and dumped the sewage right offshore. So, what happened was all of the sewage from the city of Kaneohe dumped into that south part of the bay where the water takes 30 days to go somewhere, and all of that poop basically fertilized the bay to the point where the nutrients went through the roof, it became pea soup green, and it killed off all of the corals. The best parts of Kaneohe Bay had a few live corals, the worst parts were just sludge. But enough of the community got together and fought this that in 1976, well, it ended in 1976, the sewage outfall was moved offshore into deep water and pushed away from Kaneohe Bay. So in 1976, there's no coral left, and when I show up, about 2000, it looks like this. And it looks like this today. I would have never even known there was no coral there in the past if I hadn't spoken to the community and found that out. But the thing that is really amazing is that Kaneohe Bay recovered incredibly quickly. Within 30 years, the corals came back, and we have reefs in Kaneohe Bay. So, despite the fact that it is warmer and more acidic, corals recovered. So, I like to say Kaneohe Bay is not only an ocean of the future, it is also a ray of hope for everywhere else. And we need to understand what is going on there if we hope to have coral reefs somewhere else in Hawaii when the rest of our oceans match up with the conditions in here. So, a lot of my lab and a lot of folks at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology study how exactly did Kaneohe Bay recover in this future ocean. So, my former students, who's now graduated, Chris Jury, did a study. Waimanalo has totally average ocean conditions. It looks like anywhere else. If you go to the Kona coast or if you go to Molokini Crater, the temperature and pH there is the same as everywhere else. But only about 7.5 miles away, as the larvae would disperse, we have the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology with this unusual condition of warm acidic ocean. And so he started doing this work to try to look at the corals and ask the question, are those corals really doing something different? And the way that we measure that, sorry, you had a question? Okay. So the way we measure that is we do something called a frequency distribution. If we were to take everyone in this room and measure our heights, some people are taller, and they would appear on this side. Some people are shorter, and they would appear on this side. And if we measured enough people, say a couple hundred, we would have a nice distribution where about 2/3 of the people would be average height, 1/3 of the people would be tall, 1/3 of the people would be short, and then a few would be really freakishly tall, the NBA players, and a few people would be dwarfs and be out the other end. So those height distributions are something that would match this sort of pattern. And we can do the same thing with any trait, like how well does a coral survive in warm water? So we could go through, we could plot out how one population looks. We could go to another place and plot out what that population does and ask the question, are they the same or are they different? So if we do that for a whole bunch of different coral species, and here Waimanalo Bay is in blue and Kaneohe Bay is in red, and we plot out for the different corals the response to temperature and pH, we can look at whether or not those corals are doing the same thing or not. And for the rice coral, the lace coral, and varieties, the massive coral, the finger coral that you see out there, you see differences between Waimanalo Bay corals and Kaneohe Bay corals for everything that we looked at. And what's interesting is that corals don't do the same thing. This side is temperature. Rice coral and lace coral change their ability to handle temperature. The finger coral doesn't. The temperature tolerance is exactly the same between Waimanalo Bay and Kaneohe Bay. But their ability to handle pH changes is quite different, whereas the other two don't do that. This is important because what we've done now as we've started to study more and more corals is that we find that most of them are doing this sort of thing. There are trade-offs. You can be good at one thing, you can be really good at one thing, and you can change what you are doing at that one thing. But it's really hard to change to everything all at once. And that is what I would argue we are doing to coral reefs around the world and why so many coral reefs are in decline. And I'll come back to that at the end. We know corals can change. So the question you ask, do people assume that 2050 it's the same corals and that they will not be able to do anything different? Yes, that is exactly what they assume. And the argument has always been evolution and change in species takes millions and millions of years, and climate change is happening over 100 years, so there is no chance that organisms can change fast enough to keep up with climate change. And I'll tell you why that's wrong. So, we had one of the first studies that ever looked at coral bleaching susceptibility was done in the 1970s at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. Paul Jokiel, Steve Coles, and a number of other researchers took a look at the corals. They were worried about this thing coming down in the future, an increase in temperature on the planet. And they started to look at what did it take to kill corals? How warm could they go? So they did these studies, and they found that about 31 degrees was enough to kill everything within less than 2 weeks. So if you took a look at the rice coral, and you warmed it up by about 2 degrees over the temperature back then, 31 degrees killed everything. Well, Paul Jokiel has since passed away, but Steve Coles is still around. he came back and did the exact same experiment, collected the same corals in the same place in Kaneohe Bay, used the same tanks that he did back then, and asked the question, does the same temperature kill the same corals? And what he found is, nope. If we look at the temperature, at normal temperatures in Kaneohe Bay, 28 degrees, they do just fine. If we look at 31 degrees, what killed them 50 years ago, I guess, 47 years ago, the temperature that killed all of them, we see a slight decline, but most of them, 86% of them, made it through the experiment just fine. So we know that corals can actually change the temperatures that they can tolerate over the scale of our lifetimes. What we don't know is whether or not, what the mechanism of that change is, and whether or not it's fast enough to keep up with climate change. So there was a real debate. How many of you know Coral Ruth Gates? So one of the people who was in that Chasing Corals film. She and I were hired at the same time. Our offices were next door to each other. Ruth was a coral physiologist, so we would always argue. And she would say, the corals in Kaneohe Bay are marathon runners. They're not the couch potatoes. So they've basically been trained. They're climatizing to that stress because they're being exercised. And she was very well known before she passed away for some of her really radical ideas that raised awareness for coral reefs and caused global debate on some of her ideas for what humans might do to intervene and save coral reefs from this decline. But my background is not the physiology part. My background is genetics and evolution. I'm an evolutionary biologist. And so I would always argue, if there's a flu outbreak, some of the people in this room will get sick. Some people won't. And corals are going to have the same thing. There are some things that will knock out at certain individuals and other things that those individuals will be just fine with. And we debated that for almost our entire 20 years until Ruth passed away, and we each were trying to prove the other wrong. And if you know anything about biology, it's always everything. So in the end, we were both right. But I was a little bit more right. So, if we go in and we take a look at how much of the variation in coral bleaching response we can explain by the genetics of the host, it varies by species, but something like 30 to 70% of the individuals that died in an experiment we could predict based on their genotype, their genetics, their DNA makeup. That tells us which individuals make it through those events and which individuals were going to die. Everything matters. The other half of the variation or more is a little bit of everything else, but some corals are good at it and some corals are not. And that led us to this experiment that basically we tried to decide, okay, let's create artificial coral reefs that have these future conditions and ask the question, what develops? Let's make these artificial coral reefs in fish tanks. And so we set up these 40 tanks, 10 of them at control, normal temperatures, 10 of them at low pH, 10 of them at high temperature, and 10 of them that had high temperature and low pH, the same as you would predict under future conditions at the end of the century. And they look like this, and we went in and we gathered the 8 most common coral species and hundreds of different genotypes of them. We put them all in these tanks and we let them develop. And then we looked at everything in the tanks, the algae, the larvae that settled out on the side, the tube worms, the snails, the slugs, the bacteria, the sponges. We tried to measure absolutely everything in those tanks and look at the many hundreds of species that accumulate in a natural coral reef and see whether or not the predictions about reef decline and collapse were accurate or not. Could we actually do it? And what we found was no. We could not make the reefs collapse. what we found was that the reefs completely change between the treatments. So you get a community shuffling. The species that are in there are totally different between the tanks. The reef growth slows down. Some corals did poorly, but some other corals did well. In one tank where the snails all died because of the treatment, it was replaced with a little crab or something else. So if we look at the total number of species that are in these artificial reefs that we let grow up, we end up with the same number of species at the end, but the species are totally different than one another, and something else fills in all those little jobs. What I was telling you at the beginning about my fascination with fish tanks, when people set them up, they spend a lot of money on worms and little hermit crabs and all these things that most people who look at fish tanks say, why would you spend 10 bucks on a worm? That's insane. But if people do that and they set up their tanks that way, the people who really understand it and the aquarists who really get into it and pay attention to the jobs that they do, those people have tanks that grow, that flourish, that do incredibly well. They may not resemble anything even remotely close to nature, but if you get all of the pieces of the puzzle put together, you can make a fish tank that works. And I would argue nature has an opportunity to do that, just like Kaneohe Bay. We have a very, very different reef today than we did before it was disturbed in the first place. The diversity, the corals, the species that are there sound like, we don't have biodiversity surveys and all of that back into the 1700s, but it sounds like they are a different set of species today than they were in the past. But it is still a reef. And if we take a look, I really like this Hawaiian saying, which basically translates to looking to the past to learn to move into the future. So if we look to the past and try to recreate the history of Kaneohe Bay, we have at least 800 years of Polynesian occupation and growth in that area. There's no Safeway, there's no McDonald's, nobody's going outside for any of their resources. They are living entirely off of those resources at that place. And the best guess estimate is the population is the same as Kaneohe today. So we have the same number of people living entirely off of those natural resources, and for 800 years we don't really see any decline in coral reefs. It's all modern. So what's going on here in the 1930s to 1950s when everything goes to pot? Well, people have actually done those studies and started to put them together. So we see a little bit of a decline when we have the introduction of pigs and cattle, and we start to see logging and so on. But really it's when we start to see urbanization, land development, extensive dredging, humans completely changing the landscape. When we start building things like the Hawai'i Canal and Waikiki, that we lose reefs. Suddenly, 800 years of humans is changed when we start messing in that way. And here, this incredible decline is not only those things, but it is the sewage outfall. And so when we do away with the sewage, then we start to see recovery, but it's not very stable recovery. We keep knocking it back, things keep going around, that they go up and then there's a freshwater kill or a bleaching event that knocks it back down. And so we see changes that are happening in that environment. And if we believe that corals cannot change their responses, and the climate is going to change too fast, they are predicted to be gone by 2050. But if there is some adaptation, if corals can change their tolerances, then maybe we see a different future. So the question is, if we have supercorals in Kaneohe Bay that can actually survive under these conditions, can they spread? Can they go elsewhere? Can they populate other locations? Will they move down and colonize Waimanalo when Waimanalo conditions are warmer and more acidic by the end of the century? And we've done a bunch of genetic testing, and we can actually estimate how far individuals move, and the answer is, yeah, they can move around. But maybe the more important question is, why haven't they done it already? If temperatures are already going up and we are seeing death of coral reefs, what is the trade-off? What is it that they are doing? That one thing that they are doing well, the temperature, the pH, what is it different about where they are that stops them from going elsewhere? And that is where the research really needs to go. Because in terms of our research, what we've been able to show is that Kaneohe Bay is this amazing natural laboratory. It's an ocean of the future that really gives us insight into how coral reefs are responding to climate change and responding to different human stressors, and we hope will help us to understand how to better manage them. And our experiments show that we can actually see recovery of reefs if we remove the stressors that were killing the reef in the first place. If you build a sewage outfall in the middle of Kaneohe Bay and dump all of the city of Kaneohe's sewage into the bay, you lose coral. It doesn't matter what climate change does, it matters that you take the sewage away in order for that to actually be reversed. The other thing that I think we've actually been able to show is that corals can adapt much faster than anyone thought was possible. But that may not matter if we're hitting them from every direction. So it takes 54 years for them to be able to change their temperature tolerance. If temperature goes up too fast, they may not be able to keep up with that. We may still see problems. We also see individuals out there. When we see a bleaching event, it hits areas like Kona Coast, where you say 86% of the corals have bleached. But you'll see one coral here that's totally white and dead, side by side with another coral of the same species that's totally brown. And it doesn't seem to have blinked at what killed its neighbors. What is it about that coral? Our research would suggest that coral has a different genetic makeup. That's the one that's immune to the flu. But if we don't protect that one, it can't produce any babies, and they're all done. So it really matters that we protect those stronger corals from other sources of mortality if they're going to recover. And that means changing our land use practices. Kaneohe Bay's sewage plant is one example, but cesspools and other things around the island are ongoing examples of continued sewage disposal problems that are causing all sorts of decline in reefs, and those things need to be addressed. And the last thing I would like to try and convince you of is don't give up hope. Don't say climate change is too big of a problem, I'm going to give up on coral reefs. What can I do about it? There are so many things that we can do about it. And in the absence of everything else, our tank experiments, when we don't have nutrients, when we don't have sediments, when we don't have runoff from golf courses and roads and people dredging and those sorts of things, our tank experiments show those reefs survived. They changed, but we still had a reef. But if they're getting hit from every possible direction, they cannot do that. And I like to use the example Andy Rossiter once used of an airplane. A coral reef is like an airplane. If we're flying back to the mainland in our airplane, and you take out one species for this, that's one rivet in the wing. You take out one species for that, that's another rivet out of your wing. Well, the plane might still be able to fly just fine with 2 rivets out of it, but if you're in that plane, how many rivets do you want to lose before you're not feeling so comfortable about the longevity of that plane? These are the sorts of things that we need to understand if we are going to try to manage coral reefs and make sure that they're there for our taking. And removal of all of those stressors really gives us the best chance of corals adapting to that one thing, temperature or pH, that they are really good at, but they can't do it all at once. And while I got to stand up here and talk to you, there are so many people that I have to thank who have done all of this research and all of this work. And with that, I'll try and answer any questions that you might have.
Are there any corals that can live in fresh water?
No. There's not scleractinian reef-building corals that we have seen.
I think I saw on the screen that the pH of Kaneohe Bay was 0.2.
Lower than it's 0.2 pH units lower than the open ocean.
Oh.
So,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Yes.
While you were talking, I was thinking about Honolulu Bay, which is like a dead zone for us. Have you ever thought about maybe getting some of the students and some of your research and starting a project over here to see if you can actually create a coral reef and reintroduce the whole system?
It's being done right now.
Oh, really?
So there are a group of researchers led by some of Ruth's folks who just literally this year are trying to put corals back in Honolulu Bay and see how they do.
Now, what are the conditions? Because obviously, like you said, Kaneohe Bay is very unique. So what's unique about it this one, Honolulu Bay?
It might be the most modified habitat on this entire island.
What do you mean by that?
To make Waikiki, they dug it up, changed it, completely re-engineered that entire coastline from what was an enormous watershed and basically a river delta into what is now the Honolulu Bay that you see and the Alawai Canal structures that you see today. So those things correlate really well wherever we look on the planet. Humans thinking that they are smarter than nature and redesigning nature correlate with the loss of coral reefs.
Another reef that has a great coral biodiversity, but really warm temperatures, is Ofu in American Samoa.
Yes.
If you ever get a chance to go down there and check that out, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's really warm.
I've had several of my students do their PhD there, so it's we've done a bunch of work there. Sure. Yes.
So we're going to try and keep other stressors down to allow the corals to naturally select and evolve as quickly as we discovered we were able to. As climate changes and the ocean generally gets warmer, I guess we're expecting more hurricanes. So with that in mind, I'm thinking of St. John's, Virgin Island area, that coral reefs there have changed tremendously from the national park ranges over the decades because of not only pH and temperature, but because of things like hurricanes, over trawling and stuff. So I guess you haven't seen anything recovering in, say, the Caribbean area. It's just been too stressed out by too much stuff.
There's been a lot of debate over the years about the Caribbean and why the Caribbean tanked so dramatically and so quickly relative to other places. And it's all speculation and people are debating, but I would argue it is a relatively enclosed water body like Kaneohe Bay that has an enormous number of people living around it. And we're doing the same thing to it that we were doing to Kaneohe Bay. The rest of the stuff doesn't really matter. So I think a lot of it has to do with human wastes, our disposal of what we do with our sewage and how we dispose of it, which is dump it in the ocean.
Sedimentation.
Sedimentation, runoff, the way that we deal with everything is get water off land as quickly as we can with all the runoff and take everything right out onto the reef. That is not a traditional strategy, and if you looking to the past, the way that ahupua'a management here was done, when you look at what Polynesians did, the taro fields, loikalo, basically are sediment traps. The whole point of it is to retain water, to settle out all of those sediments, to pull out all of those nutrients, and to make sure that you do not rush all of that fresh water with all of the nutrients out straight onto your coral reef because you poison your food supply. And the fact that people changed and enhanced these wetlands to maximize the areas of wetland use to remove nutrients and to retain sediments is the exact opposite strategy that we have done with urbanization in places like Honolulu and Honolulu Bay and so on. So when we look at the data, we look at the history and ask the question, when did we lose coral reefs? I would argue that there's a lot there to be learned, and I don't think most of it has to do with what is happening in the water. I think most of it has to do with what we are doing on